Myths are not stories that are untrue. Rather, they are tales that don't fit neatly into the historical record, which serve as a foundation to a culture. It's the end of the 19th century in the United States. The Civil War has been won, industry is booming, and America's first transcontinental railroad is being built. The people who built the railroad were mostly men of color, doing their best to make their way in a world hostile to them. The work was demanding and dangerous, and very few people were willing to do it, let alone strong enough to withstand the heavy labor. But the tale of one man stands out among them, a larger-than-life steel driver whose story lies somewhere between history and myth. John Henry. According to the old songs, John Henry was a massive man, strong enough to do 4 men's work. Born enslaved in the 1840s, he was freed when slavery was abolished after the Civil War. Well, sort of. Though the war was over, racism most definitely still impacted every aspect of black life, and therefore, opportunities were scarce. So with limited options, John found himself working the rails, with other formerly enslaved people, as well as convicts and other marginalized folks. It was grueling, and there were infinite tracks to lay. Workers called steel drivers used sledgehammers to drive metal drills into the ground. Then others packed the holes with dynamite to level the terrain. But John was one of the steel drivers. And not to put too fine a point on it, he was a legend. While other workers hammered endlessly into the rock, John could plant steel easily in just one swing. Not to mention, he was a favorite among the other workers, for he was kind and always willing to help anyone else who was struggling. By day, workers sang hammer songs to synchronize their movements, similar to sea shanties sailors used to haul line. And then by night, they camped out under the stars wherever the work took them, telling stories and writing letters to their families. Then one day, as John's work crew was pounding away at the tracks, they reached a massive mountain in the middle of their route. They thought they might go around it, but found that it was too broad, and they couldn't run track over it, for the mountain was too tall. With no other options, the realization sunk in that they would have to go through it. But the prospect was horrifying, and not just because it was physically difficult. Digging through a mountain of that size meant 3 years of tunneling through the cold heart of stone, working in darkness, and under the ever-present risk of collapse. Many casualties were most assured, but having no other choice, they set to work. Years passed, and the workers made good progress, in large part due to the fact that John could drive steel into rock like a knife through butter. Still, the work was deadly. There were cave-ins, dynamite accidents, and some even died of pure exhaustion. In fact, every day when they ventured into that cold darkness, they never knew if they'd be coming back. Then one evening, as everyone rested, a traveling salesman came to the camp. He wore a clean new suit, an expensive watch, and had slicked back hair. He also had a greasy, sickening grin and treated the workers with disdain. He marched past them and went straight to the foreman, carrying a briefcase with materials to pitch an amazing new invention, an automatic drill powered by steam. And the foreman was all too happy to hear about a drill that could outwork any human laborer. But John Henry knew he could do better, because as difficult as working on the railroad was, it was all he and the workers had. Without this work, they couldn't support their families, and without this work, he and thousands like him would be left with nothing. No, he wasn't going to let a machine replace them. So, he proposed a competition. Him versus the steam drill. Thinking he had the upper hand, and, of course, eager to make a sale, the salesman gladly accepted. John Henry hefted his hammer, the salesman fired up the drill, and with the shot of a pistol, off they went. The steam drill was a slick piece of machinery. It whirled and whistled, and cleaved through the mountain with ease. Seeing this, the salesman smiled smugly, until he saw John Henry. He moved through the mountain like fire-eating paper, like waves crashing onto the shore. Unstoppable, relentless, and steady. Now nervous he might lose, the salesman threw the machine into overdrive, and while it did drill into the mountain faster and faster, it eventually shook itself into pieces, collapsing into a pile of junk. That's when John Henry stopped, looked at the machine lying broken on the ground, and raised his hammer into the air, victorious. The men cheered and threw their hats into the air. Not only had John stuck it to the sleazy salesman, but he had also saved their livelihoods. However, their jubilation lasted for only a moment, until they saw the hammer slip from John Henry's hands and crash into the ground. and a moment later, John crashed down beside it. He had worked so hard and so fast, his heart had burst. His fellow workers wept at the loss of their friend and buried John Henry alongside the many others who had perished in the mountain. However, it didn't stop the march of progress. The railroad would eventually be completed, and steam would drill the tunnels for the rails. But generations found meaning in his sacrifice. His story became a symbol of resilience, a parable for the worker's spirit, and a beacon for the value of humanity in an increasingly mechanized world. Now, while the song of John Henry has been sung for quite a while, some say that now they've found his origin, claiming he was a 19-year-old convicted of burglary in New Jersey, contracted out by his jailers as cheap prison labor, and shipped to West Virginia to build the railroad. And while there's some historical evidence to support claims like this, whether true or not, to many, John Henry is more of a demigod, a symbolic personification of black strength and pre-industrial power. And hammer songs, like the one that preserved the tale of John Henry, were also sung to remind workers that they had to pace themselves, literally to slow down or die. And they were also tools of protest and resistance, in a world where so many were forced to risk their lives in the name of progress. Times have moved on. The railroad has long since been built. But they say that if you ever stand outside a tunnel where a worker has died and listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of John Henry's hammer, fighting day in and day out against the cold heart of the mountain and all those who would disparage the working man. We see you, Ahmed Ziad, Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Gunnar Clovis, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1. Thanks so much for being legendary patrons.